The legal ground you hand the enemy without realizing it. E.W. Kenyon. This is for anyone who has ever wondered why the same battle keeps returning to your door, no matter how many times you thought you already won it. Here is the premise before anything else. The book of Ephesians says it plainly. Neither give place to the devil, that is Ephesians 4:27. And Kenyon would stop you right there and say, do you see it? The verse does not say the devil takes place. It says you give it. That single word give is the whole doctrine. It means there is no invasion here without an invitation somewhere. And once you understand that, the fight stops feeling like fate and starts feeling like something you can actually manage. Now say it with me. I stand in my rights in Christ. I take back every place I gave away. I hold my ground and do not move. Again, I stand in my rights in Christ. I take back every place I gave away. I hold my ground and do not move. And if you want tomorrow's teaching to find you the same way this one did, stay close and subscribe so the next word arrives right when you need it. If something in you just went quiet while you heard that, type the 2 words "I'm ready" in the comments. Let it be your seal that you are done handing over ground you never meant to give. The first law is, the devil is not a trespasser, he is a legalist. Kenyon taught that Satan does not simply barge into a life uninvited. He studies the fine print. He looks for a legal opening, a place where the word has not been enforced, a place where fear or sin or ignorance has left a door unlatched, and he walks through that door as if he owns the deed, because in that narrow legal sense, for that moment he does. This is not a small distinction. It is the entire hinge Kenyon built his teaching on, because the moment you think of the enemy as some roaming force of raw power, you start bracing for a fight you cannot win. But the moment you understand him as a legalist working strictly within permission, the whole posture of your life changes. Think of a man who leaves his house unlocked every single night, and then wonders, morning after morning, why strangers keep wandering through his kitchen, drinking his coffee, sitting in his chair. He calls it bad luck. He calls it a rough season. He never once walks over and checks the door. The strangers are not the mystery here. The unlocked door is, and so it is with fear that goes unchallenged, with old wounds nobody ever closed the file on, with a habit of speaking defeat so often it becomes background noise. Each of those is a door left standing open long after anyone remembers opening it. So many believers treat the enemy's activity as some unstoppable weather system, something that simply rolls in on its own schedule and cannot be reasoned with. When Kenyon insisted again and again that it is closer to a landlord who only collects rent on properties nobody is defending, no defense filed, no notice given, and so the rent just quietly gets collected, month after month, year after year, and the tenant never even complains because he does not know he is allowed to. It is not that evil is stronger than you. It is that undefended ground is simply available, and available ground gets used. That is not cruelty. That is just how legal ground behaves. So before you spend one more year treating the same recurring battle as some mysterious curse assigned to your life specifically, ask the older question first. Where exactly is the gate standing open? Because once you find the gate, you are no longer fighting fate. You are simply doing the one thing that was always yours to do. You are closing a door. That reframe alone changes the whole posture of your life. I lock what is mine and defend it daily. The second law is, your words are the actual currency this transaction is paid in. Kenyon taught that confession is not a religious decoration. It is a legal instrument, a binding document read aloud in a courtroom that never adjourns. When you speak fear out loud, when you say, I am always going to be broke, or I will never get past this, or this sickness has me now, you are not merely describing a feeling, you are signing a title over. because your mouth carries authority in this arrangement, whether you intend it to or not. Picture a woman standing in her own front yard, loudly announcing to every passing neighbor that anyone is welcome to move into her house. She does not mean it as an invitation. She is only venting, only letting off steam, the way anyone might after a hard day. But the words go out into the air anyway, and someone eventually takes her up on it. And now think of an ordinary man at his kitchen table. He opens a bill he already expected, and instead of simply handling it, he says out loud, "Well, I guess I will always be behind on money." That sentence felt small. It felt like nothing more than a tired sigh. But Kenyon would say a legal notice just went out, and it went out in the man's own voice, using the man's own authority. Because in this arrangement, no outside voice needs to declare the verdict when the owner of the house keeps declaring it for them. That is what careless confession does inside a life. It is not that speaking creates evil out of nothing. Evil does not need to be manufactured from a stray sentence. It is that speaking releases legal ground that was previously still yours to hold and hands the paperwork to whoever is listening for it. So the discipline Kenyon taught was never clever positive thinking. It was never about pretending the bill is not real or the diagnosis is not there. It is simply refusing to sign away in words what has not yet been signed away in truth. Watch what you say about what is yours. And this is exactly where most people lose the ground without ever once seeing the paperwork move, because nobody warned them the transaction was even happening, while they were only trying to talk about their day. The third law is, ignorance is the quietest legal loophole of all. Kenyon taught that a right you do not know you have is a right you cannot exercise. And an enemy who understands law better than you do will simply proceed as though that right does not exist, because functionally, for you, it does not. This is not a small technicality tucked into the corner of the doctrine. Kenyon treated it as one of the most costly conditions a believer can live under, because it does not feel like a crisis while it is happening. It feels like ordinary life. Imagine a man who inherited a fortune but never opened the letter, telling him so. He lives the rest of his years in poverty, not because the money was not real, but because he never claimed what the document already made legally his. He rations his food. He apologizes for asking for help. He measures out his days in scarcity. And the entire time the deed sits sealed in a drawer with his name already on it. That is the tragedy Kenyon kept returning to. Believers living defeated, not because heaven withheld anything, but because nobody ever sat them down and showed them what was already theirs. Now picture that same man finally opening the letter. Nothing about his bank account changed in that moment. The fortune was already his the whole time. What changed was simply that he now knew, and knowing is what let him finally act like an heir instead of a beggar. That is the exact gap Kenyon spent his ministry trying to close. So the enemy in this system is not fighting you for territory you are actively holding. He is quietly occupying territory you forgot you owned. Think about how differently a person walks into a courtroom when they know the law is already on their side, compared to how they walk in when they merely hope it might be. One person sits forward, asks questions, speaks with steady confidence. The other person shrinks, apologizes for existing, agrees to unfavorable terms, simply because they are not sure what they are entitled to. Kenyon taught that this second posture describes far too many believers, not because they lack standing, but because nobody ever read them the will. Consider an ordinary week. A man facing financial pressure never once considers that provision was already promised to him, because he was never taught it, so he negotiates from fear instead of from position. A woman facing sickness never once considers that healing was already settled ground, because nobody showed her the deed, so she negotiates from panic instead of from authority. In both cases, the outcome is not decided by whether the promise was real. The promise was real all along. The outcome is decided by whether the person knew enough to stand on it. So the enemy negotiates with a person who does not even know they are holding a winning hand, and he does it calmly, without struggle, because an opponent who does not know their own rights rarely thinks to assert them. It is not that you lack the authority, it is that you were never shown where it was filed. I learn what is legally mine and I use it. And once a person actually sees that gap closing, once they finally open that sealed letter for themselves, the next question becomes unavoidable, because knowing the right on paper and living from it under pressure are two very different disciplines. The fourth law is living by the report of your senses instead of the report of the word is one of the most common ways ground quietly changes hands. Kenyon called this the difference between sense knowledge and revelation knowledge. Sense knowledge is what your eyes see, what your body feels, what the test result says, what the bank statement says, and none of that is fake. The numbers on the page are real. The ache in the body is real. Kenyon never once taught you to pretend the visible thing is not there. What he taught is that sense knowledge was never appointed as the final judge of what is true for you. It is only ever the current evidence of what is temporarily visible, and there is a very real difference between current evidence and final verdict. Think of a farmer who plants seed in early spring and then walks out every single morning to stare at bare dirt, declaring nothing is happening here, nothing is ever going to happen here. His eyes are not lying to him. The dirt really does look empty. The surface tells the truth, as far as the surface goes, but his eyes are reporting on a timeline his senses were never built to access. Underneath that same soil, roots are already forming in the dark, long before a single green shoot breaks through. So if he lets the bare dirt talk him into plowing the field under in frustration, he destroys the very harvest that was already legally his by the terms of the seed he planted. Now bring that into an ordinary week. A man gets a discouraging report from a doctor on a Monday, and by Tuesday he has already rearranged his whole week around the worst version of that report. He has told his boss. He has told his wife. He has quietly started saying things like, "Well, this is just how it is now." None of that felt dramatic. It felt like simple honesty about the facts in front of him. But Kenyon would say, the facts in front of him were never given the authority to be the last word, only the first word. So when a believer looks only at the visible symptom and makes that the whole verdict, they are unknowingly handing the legal floor over to whichever voice shouts loudest through the senses, instead of the one that was actually recorded in writing. It is not that your feelings are enemies, it is that they were never issued a vote in what is legally true. I judge by the record, not by the report, and this sets up the deepest part of the whole teaching, because if senses can quietly reroute your authority in something as simple as a Monday morning report, then an ordinary day is full of far more legal transactions than most people ever notice. The fifth law is the one Kenyon spent the most time unpacking, because this is where the actual mechanism lives, not as one dramatic event, but as a slow accumulation, and it unfolds best in pieces, so walk through it with me one at a time, slowly, because this is the part most people rush past on their way to feeling better, and rushing past it is exactly how the ground keeps changing hands. First, consider fear. Kenyon taught that fear is faith in reverse. It is believing the bad report with total conviction. And because belief is the very currency this whole legal system runs on, fear functions as a signed contract handed to the wrong party. It does not need to be loud to be binding. A quiet dread carried silently in the chest all day is still a transaction. Picture a woman waking at 6 in the morning, already replaying the diagnosis in her mind before her feet even touch the floor. By 6:15, she has confessed dread out loud to her own reflection in the bathroom mirror. By 7, she has told her sister the worst is probably coming. By lunchtime, she has told 2 coworkers the same thing. And by mid-afternoon, she has rehearsed the worst outcome so many times it feels like memory instead of forecast. None of that felt like a transaction. It felt like honesty. It felt like simply preparing herself for reality. But Kenyon would say every one of those moments was a small notarized signature, quietly transferring ground she was never required to give away. Fear convinces you it is merely describing the weather, when really it is redrawing the property line one sentence at a time. Second, consider unconfessed sin. Not because sin is a secret shame to be paraded before an audience, but because Kenyon taught that hidden sin functions like an unpaid legal debt. It sits on the books whether or not you look at it, quietly accruing, and an enemy operating on legal terms will always point at outstanding debt as his right of entry. This is not about performance or about proving yourself worthy through effort. The fix was never groveling. Kenyon was clear that grace already covers it fully. The fix is simply bringing it into the light, through honest confession, so the account is closed, and there is nothing left on the ledger to leverage. A man who owes a debt he refuses to acknowledge is still legally in debt. The acknowledging itself is what closes the file. Third, consider unbelief toward the word itself. This one is quieter than fear and sneakier than sin, because it does not look like open rebellion. It looks like polite doubt, wearing the mask of maturity. A man reads a promise about provision, nods respectfully, even underlines it in his Bible, and then lives the rest of his week, planning as though the promise were only a nice sentiment, meant for someone braver or luckier than himself. He would never call it unbelief, he would call it being realistic. But Kenyon taught that this soft unbelief is still unbelief, and unbelief always leaves the door on its hinges rather than locked. It does not slam anything shut. It simply never gets around to closing it. Fourth, consider self-condemnation, the quiet voice at 9 at night reviewing every failure of the day and handing down a private verdict of unworthy, replaying the sharp words spoken to a spouse, the deadline missed, the temper lost in traffic, turning each one over like evidence in a trial where the verdict was decided before the evening even began. Kenyon taught that this one is especially costly because it does not just open a door, it convinces you that you have no right to shut it again. A man who believes he is disqualified will not even reach for the key sitting right beside him. He will simply let the door stand open and call that humility. Now lay that whole day end to end. 6 in the morning fear, 7 o'clock spoken dread, midday unbelief, dressed as realism, an unresolved matter never brought to light, 9 at night, a private verdict of unworthy. None of it looked dramatic while it was happening. There was no thunderclap, no visible collapse, just an ordinary Tuesday. That is exactly Kenyon's point. Ground is rarely lost in one visible catastrophe. It is lost in small, unremarked transactions, repeated until a pattern sets in, and the pattern starts to feel like personality instead of something that can be changed. So pause for a moment right now and pick one real hour from your own yesterday, just one honest hour, and ask plainly what you said in it, what you believed in it, what you left unresolved in it. Because until you can see the hour clearly, you cannot close the door standing inside it. It is not that the enemy is clever. It is that most of us were never shown where the deed quietly changes hands in the small, unremarkable minutes. I watch the hour, not just the headline. The sixth law is, taking ground back is also a legal act, not an emotional one. Kenyon taught that the new creation already holds a standing higher than the one being contested. So reclaiming ground is never a desperate scramble to become worthy of victory. It is simply enforcing a right that was legally settled long before the pressure ever showed up at your door. Think of a homeowner who comes home to find squatters camped out in his back room. He does not need to invent new laws in his favor. He does not need to beg a judge for a fresh ruling. He already holds the deed, filed and signed, so he does not fight for ownership. He only enforces ownership he already had. He walks to that doorway, plants his feet, and says plainly, "This is mine, and I am enforcing it now." That is exactly the picture Kenyon painted over and over. So many believers approach spiritual warfare like they are still trying to win the house, straining and pleading and hoping the verdict tips their way, when the deed was already recorded the moment they were placed in Christ. The fight was never for the title. The fight is simply enforcing a title you already hold. And enforcement looks almost embarrassingly plain. It looks like standing in the same spot day after day and calmly repeating what is legally true until the squatter finally understands the homeowner is not leaving. Picture a man who lost peace in his home to nightly worry. He does not need a new deliverance every evening. He needs to stand at that same doorway of his mind each night and declare the same plain sentence, "This house is mine," and mean it. Because Kenyon taught that steady repetition of truth is not weakness. It is exactly how enforcement works in the legal realm. So the very mouth that once signed ground away carelessly in an earlier law is the same mouth now standing in the doorway, taking it back on purpose. That is the full circle Kenyon kept pointing toward. The transaction runs both ways, and you were always the one holding the pen. I enforce what is already legally mine. Here is the whole picture. Ground is never taken from you by force alone. It is only ever handed over. First you saw the enemy needs an open gate rather than raw power. Then you saw your own words are the currency that opens or seals it. Then you saw ignorance of your rights leaves the gate unlatched without you ever choosing that. Then you saw living by the senses instead of the record quietly hands the vote away. Then you walked through a single ordinary day and watched fear and doubt and unresolved matters and self-condemnation open small doors 1 hour at a time. And finally, you saw that reclaiming ground is not a struggle to win, but a right already yours, simply waiting to be enforced. It was never 6 separate battles. It was one single legal ground being negotiated all day long every day in words you were speaking before you ever noticed you were speaking them. So say it with me one final time. I stand in my rights in Christ. I take back every place I gave away. I hold my ground and do not move. That is the legal ground you were never meant to hand over, and that is the ground you now know exactly how to keep